William and Catherine have officially moved out of Windsor, and the reason for their departure is maybe one of the most unsettling things I've seen in a long time. It's unnerving because it's the kind of thing that makes you look at your own house differently at night. Not because it's sensational, as most royal stories are. There's no conflict, no leaked email, no awkward balcony moment. The narrative begins with a standard structural examination at Adelaide Cottage, the comparatively humble residence on the Windsor estate, where the Prince and Princess of Wales relocate in order to provide their children with a more typical upbringing. In approximately 17 minutes, what the engineers discovered beneath the cottage altered everything. They were performing a routine inspection of the property's foundation, the kind of thing that frequently happens with historic homes. There is a system of subterranean passageways beneath that peaceful, quaint house that predates the present building by centuries, some of which date back to the English Civil War. For some reason, these tunnels had been entirely forgotten, not only by the family, but also by every official document security check and survey that had been carried out on the land over many years. This is where things become strange, since the alarm was set off by something inside the tunnels, rather than just the tunnels themselves. Before I go into the specifics, let me introduce you to Royals Insider Deutsch. We analyze royal stories as they truly occurred, not as headlines would have you believe. Click subscribe to ensure you don't miss any updates as this issue progresses. This is the timeline then. On a Tuesday in late November, it is around midnight. About 3 hours prior, William and Catherine had gone to bed. George, Charlotte, and Louis were all fast sleeping. Adelaide Cottage's walls were equipped with infrared sensors that detected movement where none should have occurred. William was the first to awaken, which is consistent with his military experience. He had been trained for years to react to even the smallest disturbance. So when security guards began to move through the lower hallways, the minor change in air pressure was enough to wake him. Mothers in these circumstances simply wake up, and Catherine did so nearly instantly. They didn't say anything. Years of being in the spotlight had taught them that listening might reveal more about a possible disaster than ever asking questions. There was a gentle but persistent knock on their bedroom door, the kind that conveys urgency without instilling fear. William took 4 steps across the room and opened the door to discover their head of personal protection, Marcus Headley, standing in the dark corridor, with a look that said it all, without using words. 3 more officers stood behind him, making it obvious that this was not a rehearsal, not a false alarm, and that no one was going to brush it off with promises and go back to sleep. Headley informed them that the inspection's structural experts had found something that turned a calm Tuesday night evaluation into an emergency evacuation procedure. There was proof of recent and frequent human activity beneath the cottage, in areas that had never been visited or even mapped in living memory. I'm not saying, oh, someone wandered through here 50 years ago. A folding chair that was surprisingly clean, a thermal blanket, the empty water bottles with purchase dates from the previous month, tools that showed no signs of rust footprints and dust that had not yet settled, and most unsettling of all, recent surveillance photos of the Wales family going about their daily lives, taken from angles that suggested the photographer had intimate knowledge of their schedules, movements, and patterns. The family had slept above that house, but someone had been underneath it more than once. This was an ongoing effort. Before Headley completed his briefing, Catherine was already heading for the kids' bedroom. I remember that particular detail. She didn't wait to hear the whole story. She didn't seek an explanation. She started moving as soon as she realized that her kids' safety was in jeopardy. While investigators determined the entire extent of what was going on beneath their house, George, Charlotte, and Louis needed to be softly awakened, swiftly dressed, and taken to a secure location. And in that corridor, Catherine, who had spent years developing this image of calm competence, lost her composure just enough to show the intense protectiveness that informs every choice she makes as a mother. As she explained to 3 bewildered kids that they were going on an unexpected journey in the middle of the night, William stood in the hallway and watched her silhouette travel from bed to bed. Her voice was a quiet murmur of assurance. At 11 years old, George was starting to realize that living as a royal came with challenges that ordinary families never had to deal with. At 9 years old, Charlotte was perceptive and astute enough to raise the question that pierced through every well-crafted explanation. "Mommy, are we safe here?" William could sense the weight of duty rest more solidly on Catherine's shoulders during her brief pause. The actual evacuation proceeded in accordance with the lack of experience of a security force that continuously prepares for situations they hope will never arise. William dragged Louis down the stairs, still dazed from sleep at 6. With a hand on each shoulder, Catherine led the older kids. The amount of planning that goes into keeping this family safe is demonstrated by the fact that staff members had previously packed necessary goods from lists that are updated on a quarterly basis and kept in safe places across the property. With their engines running and their itineraries already planned and shared with the larger security network, 3 cars waited in the drive. Catherine turned to take one final look at the house, where they had created something priceless as they stepped out into the cold. Adelaide Cottage had been a conscious decision. They had relocated there especially to provide the children with gardens to explore rooms that seemed more like their own than museum exhibits, and a childhood that valued freedom and space above Kensington Palace's fortress-like protection. Its familiar corners and cozy windows had become unsure as it stood behind them in the dark. Her hand found William's. At precisely 43 minutes past midnight, the motorcade departed, leaving behind a property that was already being turned into a crime scene, an archaeological site, and a security nightmare that would eventually need to be explained to the king, the government, and the public in a carefully controlled manner. The following morning, white forensic tents had appeared all over Adelaide Cottage's grounds, each signifying a point of entry to the subterranean network. At midnight, Detective Chief Inspector Sarah Wainwright was called in due to her knowledge of historical property crimes and her security clearance, which enabled her to operate within the unique limitations of royal investigations. What she saw beneath Windsor's well-kept lawns called into question everyone's preconceived notions about the safety of the most well-known royal residence in Britain. The primary tunnel network was far larger than the preliminary studies had shown. Wainwright's team used thermal imaging and ground-penetrating radar to locate passageways that linked Adelaide Cottage to Windsor Castle and 4 other estate houses, including Frogmore Cottage and Royal Lodge. When you give it any thought, the ramifications are rather astounding. No one was aware of the existence of a network of access points that circumvented all contemporary security measures, checkpoints, and meticulously calibrated systems intended to protect the royal family from threats that changed with every decade, for years if not decades. However, the tunnels themselves were historical features that could be secured if their length was adequately surveyed, notwithstanding their anxiety. The proof of recent and frequent access in one chamber, just below Prince Louis's bedroom, which was situated 20 feet above, was what turned this from an infrastructure issue into a real security catastrophe. The tiny camp photos were discovered by investigators to be modern surveillance photos of the Wales family going about their everyday life, rather than old history photos. The photos gave the impression that someone had been observing their daily activities with frightening attention to detail. Catherine's morning runs through the estate school drop-off times and the times when shift changes resulted in the least amount of security. This was a systematic observation, not a casual one. On that first day, William got information every hour. With every briefing, the picture became more and more unsettling. He and Catherine had brought the kids to a safe place at Kensington Palace, and they were both aware of how ironic it was that they had relocated to Windsor in order to give their kids more freedom, more room, and more of the childhood normalcy they both cherished. They were now sitting in the flat that used to be their main place of abode, explaining to three pairs of curious eyes why they were still unable to go home. The inquiry proceeded cautiously due to its historical significance, while simultaneously moving quickly due to royal security concerns. Every object discovered in the tunnels had to be recorded, photographed, and examined for its historical significance as well as security implications. Working alongside counter-terrorism experts was Dr. Helena Ashworth of the Royal Collection Trust. Her knowledge of the architecture of the Tudor and Stuart eras was suddenly essential to comprehending how these passageways had eluded contemporary surveys and security sweeps for such a long time. A partial picture had surfaced by mid-afternoon. At least as old as the 1600s, if not earlier, the network of tunnels predated Adelaide Cottage during World War II. Windsor Castle was reinforced against possible German invasion, and the young princesses Elizabeth and Margaret sought refuge there during the Blitz, as evidenced by some sections. However, the entire scope of these tunnels had been forgotten at some point in the decades that had passed. In the extensive archives of royal holdings, it may have survived in fragments of documents that had been misplaced, disregarded, or just forgotten. Every investigator, security guard, and official who was briefed throughout that exhausting day was plagued by the identical question that Catherine had posed in the dimly lit hallway of Adelaide Cottage. Who had found these tunnels again? And what did they want to accomplish by having such close contact to the family of the future king? After receiving his briefing at Clarence House, King Charles's response was meticulously controlled in front of staff, but it was evident in the phone call he made to William soon after. The king has had decades of security, worries, bedroom intruders, mysterious shipments, and real threats that necessitated ongoing attention to detail. However, this seemed different, more subtle, because it showed that the protection that everyone had taken for granted was not being provided by the very earth beneath their feet. By nightfall, the probe had grown to include MI5, whose proficiency in threat assessment and counterintelligence offered resources that even the most advanced Royal Protection Squad could not match. Agents started the laborious task of going over surveillance footage from the previous 6 months, searching for trends, faces that showed up too often, and cars that stayed too long in places where they could see Adelaide Cottage. The digital forensics team started examining the photos that were discovered underground, extracting metadata, figuring out what kind of camera was used, and creating a profile of the person who had spent a lot of time and money observing the Wales family. As the day went on, Catherine tried to keep things regular for the kids, but George's queries grew more sharp. He was enough knowledgeable about security procedures to understand that this was not a standard evacuation or a straightforward maintenance problem that could be fixed with a few fixes and a return home by the end of the week. William discovered his oldest son standing at a window overlooking Kensington Gardens, his youthful shoulders set in a position that uncomfortably reminded the prince of himself at that age, already discovering that living as a royal meant facing dangers that other kids never had to think about. The father and son had a quick but sincere chat that was designed to accept reality without overwhelming a boy who was still figuring out how to live a life he had not chosen. Years ago, William made a self-promise to himself that he would not emulate the emotional remoteness of his own upbringing, and that his kids would know they could come to him with concerns, questions, and the messy issues of growing up under unheard-of scrutiny. This dedication was now being put to the test by situations that called for a careful balancing act between protection and openness. The examination at Windsor proceeded under portable illumination as night settled over London, creating odd shadows on the once tranquil grounds. The effort would continue through the night and into the days that followed, with new issues, queries, and justifications for why going back to their house was not a decision that could be made hastily or carelessly emerging every hour. Day 3's morning briefing revealed information that changed the focus of the investigation from security concerns to issues of historical conspiracy and contemporary obsession. Documents that were meticulously stored in waterproof containers were among the artifacts found in the tunnels, indicating that the person gaining access to these areas had been conducting research that went much beyond mere monitoring. Annotations, cross-references, and hypotheses that spoke to someone on a quest that merged history with perilous fiction had been written on maps from many eras. The materials were examined and contextualized by Professor James Harrington, a historian who specializes in royal properties and their hidden architecture. He was disturbed by what he discovered in ways that academic study seldom accomplishes. The maps and notes indicated that someone had developed an obsession with the notion of secret riches purportedly kept by royals during turbulent political times. There were many references to the English Civil War and rumors that gold and jewels might have been concealed in tunnels beneath Windsor to keep them out of the hands of Parliament. This was not academic study. This was the work of someone who had allowed historical interests to become an obsession, someone who was prepared to cross all legal and safety boundaries in order to investigate beliefs that were only found in the shadowy recesses of conspiracy theories and online forums. Detective Chief Inspector Wainwright led William through the developing profile while he sat across from her. The intruder, as that was now the obvious designation, seemed to be someone who was well-versed in historical texts, had access to resources that enabled them to purchase ground-penetrating radar equipment, and had the patience to carry out underground exploration and surveillance for a considerable amount of time. The proof that this had been going on for much longer than the previous months, as shown by the water bottles and equipment, was arguably the most unsettling. Investigators discovered earlier camps and artifacts from over 2 years ago deeper down the tunnel system in chambers that required crawling through areas barely big enough for an adult body. Journals full of observations written in a small hand that grew harder to read, as though the author had been plunging into a state of mind that corresponded with the physical plunge beneath Windsor. With every fresh briefing, Catherine reacted with the restrained rage of a mother whose instinct to protect her children had been violated in the most intrusive way possible. She had come to terms with the loss of privacies associated with her position. This was radically different from the cameras that track her every public appearance and remark on everything from her parenting choices to her dress choices. This was the person who had been beneath their house while her kids slept, above someone who had observed, waited, and planned something that was yet unknown, but seemed evil in its methodical implementation. Securing the tunnel entrances was only one aspect of the decision of when, or even if, they could return to Adelaide Cottage. For surveillance equipment, each room would have to be swept. A security upgrade would be necessary for the entire property, turning their house into something much more akin to a stronghold. And in a time when security threats might come from both inside and outside the gates, the very feature that had made Adelaide Cottage appealing, its relative modesty and accessibility within the Windsor estate, had turned into its fatal fault. Senior members of the royal household, government representatives, and security officers gathered at Buckingham Palace for a conference called by King Charles. Driven by the realization that this episode had revealed vulnerabilities that went well beyond a particular property. The discourse was candid in a way that royal meetings never accomplish. What other historical aspects of royal properties would pose comparable concerns if the tunnels beneath Windsor had been overlooked and exploited? The Tower of London, with its medieval underpinnings, Hampton Court Palace, with its secrets from the Tudor era, and even Buckingham Palace itself, which had been constructed and reconstructed over centuries, including corridors and constructions that might not be found in any contemporary survey. The topic of public disclosure, which usually complicates problems pertaining to royal security, came up. The Wales family had been missing from Adelaide Cottage for a few days. Their routines had been disturbed, and something strange was happening at Windsor, as the media had already started to notice. Controlling the story would necessitate carefully weighing the amount of truth that might be revealed without jeopardizing the current inquiry or offering guidance to others who could be motivated by this intrusion. That evening, William and Catherine sat together in Kensington Palace, the kids finally falling asleep after a day of attempting to keep up regular activities and educational routines under clearly unusual circumstances. The husband and wife discussed topics they had been avoiding. They wondered if they had unintentionally exposed their kids to dangers that would have been avoided at more conventional royal homes because they wanted to provide them with a more grounded upbringing. There was no blame in the conversation, just a mutual understanding that every choice they made about how to raise their family involved trade-offs that occasionally showed up in unpleasant ways. This allowed the investigators to identify a suspect, even if the person had not yet been found. Analysis of security footage had shown a pattern of a single male thought to be in his late 40s, being seen frequently enough in the vicinity of Adelaide Cottage to call for further investigation. When police arrived to question him, they discovered a rented cottage that had been abandoned in a hurry. There was evidence that suggested he had somehow known that his underground access had been discovered and that he needed to immediately depart. His vehicle had been followed to a site 3 miles from Windsor. Resources normally used for counter-terrorism activities were used in the ensuing manhunt. This person had shown that he was aware of royal properties, had access to surveillance equipment, and was prepared to devote years to whatever objective had led him into those tunnels. It was unknown whether that objective was theft injury or something else entirely, but the uncertainty alone was dangerous enough to warrant law enforcement and intelligence services' full attention. Instead of using security film or forensic proof, the identification of him was made possible by a source that demonstrated how completely the internet has changed the landscape of royal fascination. Over the course of the previous 18 months, a number of posts that were becoming more and more alarming were brought to the attention of a moderator of an internet forum devoted to royal history. Under the alias Windsor Truth Seeker, the user had been posting in-depth speculations about buried treasures beneath royal palaces, along with maps that were remarkably similar to the annotated documents discovered in the tunnels beneath Adelaide Cottage. To examine the digital imprint, Dr. Miranda Foster, a psychologist with expertise in parasocial ties with prominent figures and compulsive behaviors, was consulted. What she discovered revealed a person whose fascination with royal history had developed into something much more problematic. The writer eventually expressed the opinion that he had been selected to reveal facts that the royal family was purposefully concealing from the British public. The posts demonstrated a transition from scholarly inquiry to conspiracy theory to personal grievance. The wording alluded to someone who had created a whole story in which he was the main character in a historical drama, and who was justified in his intrusions because he was doing it for a greater good. After extensive digital research, the true identity was discovered. Malcolm Hendricks, a 47-year-old former museum curator at a small historical society in Kent, was fired 3 years prior due to his increasingly unpredictable and compulsive behavior, according to colleagues. Following his dismissal, Hendricks reportedly committed himself full-time to studying royal properties. He used his knowledge of archival research and his remaining great competence in historical architecture to investigate notions that only existed in his increasingly solitary head. Hendricks's combination of true expertise and declining judgment made him especially dangerous. He was proficient in reading historical records. He was capable of deciphering building blueprints. He was skilled at conducting research in archives covertly. However, at some point in his solitary quest, he had gone from scholarship to delusion, persuading himself that the Wales family was somehow preventing him from making historical findings that would establish his fame and demonstrate that his expulsion from the museum had been the result of unfair persecution. when the journals discovered in the most remote areas of the tunnel system are ultimately transcribed and examined. The mind that had been spending more and more time underground, sometimes for periods of 8 or 10 hours, is revealed. Hendricks had written on how he felt more at ease in the tunnels than in the outside world, and how the quiet and darkness helped him reflect on how near he felt to the past he was discovering. Hendricks apparently developed parasocial ties with family members he had only ever seen from a distance, or via the lens of his camera, as seen by the notes about the Wales family that started out as straightforward observations, but developed into something more intimate. After receiving the psychological evaluation, William came to the sobering realization that strengthening physical protection alone would not be sufficient to address this threat. Despite a nationwide alert to law enforcement authorities, Hendricks remained at large, and his present location is unknown. According to the profile, he probably wouldn't give up on his fixation just because his tunnel access had been found. A person who had dedicated years to pursuing his theories, crossed all legal and private boundaries, and built an entire personality around his underground explorations, was not going to just leave and go back to their regular life. Catherine had to deal with George's questions, which she found difficult to honestly respond to without undermining his confidence. Her oldest kid had heard enough snippets of adult discussions to deduce that someone had been keeping an eye on their family, that this person had been hiding beneath their house, and that he was still missing. In the end, she had one of the most challenging conversations of her life as a mother, striking a balance between the necessity to recognize actual danger and the equally crucial need to keep terror from taking over George's early years. Adelaide Cottage's security improvements went well, changing the property every week. Instead of just being shut, the tunnel entrances were equipped with sensors that would identify any attempts at entry. Additional monitoring equipment, facial recognition software, and security cameras were installed on the property to make future breaches much more challenging. Even while each renovation was required, it was nevertheless a step away from the relative normalcy that had initially drawn people to Adelaide Cottage. In the meantime, the investigation grew to look into whether Hendricks had been operating independently or as a member of a larger group of royal enthusiasts who exchanged information and possibly even planned events. The online forums where he had been active exposed a subculture that most people are unaware of: a virtual underground, where conspiracy theories about the royal family thrive and people push one another to act in ways that are increasingly transgressive in search of a truth that only exists in their collective delusions. The Wales family suffered psychologically in both overt and covert ways. Lewis's 6-year-old mind processed the upheaval through nightmares about creatures in the ground, necessitating patient reassurance every night. Catherine was devastated by Charlotte's hypervigilance over locked doors and closed windows as she meticulously checked and double-checked security measures. George retreated into silent contemplation, observing his parents' expressions for indications of concern that they were unable to conceal. By the third week, the family's circumstances had become a somber reality. In their minds, Adelaide Cottage had become a location where someone had broken their most fundamental feeling of safety. Regardless of whether Hendricks was captured, the tunnels were fully guarded, or all other security measures were put in place. There was nothing wrong with the cottage itself. The rooms and walls were just as lovely and cozy as they had been prior to that midnight alarm. However, something vital about the area had been tainted by the knowledge of what had been going on under them, of the planning, waiting, and watching that had taken place while they slept, oblivious above. William and Catherine started talking about other options. These conversations felt like admissions of defeat, but they were also acknowledged as essential. Maybe a different Windsor estate land, free of the historical burden of abandoned tunnels and the compulsive violation of someone else. Maybe a full-time return to Kensington Palace, accepting the compromise of less space and solitude in return for the multi-layered security that comes with a house that has been occupied and watched over for decades. Maybe something completely different, a solution that had not yet come to light, but may help them regain the feeling of home that Hendricks had stolen from them. When the decision was finally made, it was presented as a strategic decision based on thorough security assessments rather than as a defeat. However, underlying the formal jargon, William and Catherine both recognized the truth. The poisoned knowledge that their refuge had been defiled in ways that could not be fully undone was forcing them to abandon their house rather than a direct threat or urgent danger. Adelaide Cottage arrived on the morning of their formal departure with the kind of gray November rain that appears to be intended to go along with gloomy feelings. Later that day, the news would be delivered to the media, carefully worded to satisfy interest, while omitting information that could jeopardize existing security investigations or encourage others with similar obsessions. In order to make way for extensive infrastructural and security improvements at Adelaide Cottage, the Wales family was moving their main home. This procedure was anticipated to take several months, at the very least, and probably longer, depending on the extent of the work needed. Age-appropriate talks that struck a mix between assurance and candor had prepared the kids during the previous few days. George was the most perceptive, inquiring about the inquiry that demonstrated his growing understanding of the complex reality of their lives. Charlotte had come to terms with moving faster, and her adaptability and resiliency were already demonstrating the strength of character that would benefit her in the years to come. Lewis was already inquiring about the toys that would be brought to their new house and whether there would be gardens to explore, even though he was still young enough to adjust to change rather easily if his parents continued to be dependable. With the exception of the constant security team that kept a polite distance, Catherine strolled through Adelaide Cottage one last time by herself. Over the years they had resided there, memories had accumulated in each room. The kitchen, where she had tried both basic weeknight dinners and lavish birthday cakes, delighting in the domestic rituals that bound her to mothers everywhere. Family movie nights had grown to be treasured customs in the sitting room, the bedrooms where her children had developed from infants to adolescents, with unique personalities and growing independence. These memories had not been destroyed by the violation that had caused them to leave, but they had been tarnished with information that she was unable to unlearn. Williams cataloged both practical fact and emotional attachment throughout his last stroll. Although the security improvements would be extensive and essential, they would also drastically alter the property's character. Adelaide Cottage would become more secure, but it would also become more like every other royal home, covered in layers of protocol and technology that made it safer at the expense of the relaxed comfort they had cherished. Neither he nor Catherine had properly addressed the subject of whether they would ever genuinely wish to return, even after months of rehabilitation and security improvements. The actual relocation was carried out with military precision, with personnel and security working together to relocate the family's possessions to their new home with the least amount of disturbance to the kids' daily schedules. They were going back to Kensington Palace, at least temporarily, so that long-term decisions concerning their living arrangements could be made thoughtfully, rather than in a rush. The flat was familiar, having been their headquarters in London during their years in Adelaide Cottage, but it would now have to act as their primary residence. This change necessitated both practical and emotional adaptations. On their third night back at Kensington, King Charles paid them a visit. They had a private supper, during which they talked about family security and the difficulty of attempting to live a regular life while always facing criticism from the public and possible danger. The king spoke from experience, having weathered decades of security issues and made several adjustments to his own life to deal with the fact that being royal required putting up with limitations that most people would find unacceptable. However, he also recognized that every generation had unique difficulties and that the problems William and Catherine were facing were a contemporary manifestation of historical dangers. Malcolm Hendricks's investigation persisted with great vigor, but disappointingly little advancement. He appeared to have disappeared with the thoroughness of someone who had been preparing for the prospect of discovery, despite the nationwide warning and public calls for information. A forensic examination of his leased cottage revealed evidence of a thorough investigation into royal sites outside of Windsor, including intricate maps of Sandringham and Balmoral that implied he had been considering extending his underground searches to other royal estates. The psychiatric evaluation had been revised to take into account mounting worries that Hendrix's loneliness and fixation could push him beyond surveillance into riskier and more direct behavior. Over the weeks that followed their departure, the effects on the kids became more apparent. George started to take his queries regarding security procedures more seriously, as if he was starting to realize that his future would require continual watchfulness and limited freedom. Anxiety showed up as Charlotte's unwillingness to sleep alone and her need for Catherine's presence until she fell asleep every night. Louis, whose young mind was able to accept the new normal without thinking about the reasons behind it, seemed to adjust the easiest. However, he occasionally inquired when they would return to our real residence, a question that neither parent could definitively answer. In addition to the loss of their house, Catherine was grieving the loss of a plan for raising their kids. Adelaide Cottage had been a conscious decision to give George, Charlotte, and Louis as much freedom and space as their situation would permit, putting family life ahead of royal convenience. That decision had now been shown as possibly foolish, a well-meaning attempt to normalize lives that were, and always would be, genuinely odd. She was plagued by an unreasonable sense of guilt. The persistent question of whether she had unintentionally exposed her children to risks that may have been averted with more conventional royal housing arrangements because she wanted to offer them a particular kind of childhood. William battled his own version of the same guilt, which was made worse by the realization that his family would always be the focus of obsession, resentment, and threats, both real and imagined, because he would become king. He had attempted to design a life that struck a balance between responsibility and parenthood, public service, and personal happiness, the weight of history, and the lightness that youth ought to have. The occurrence at Adelaide Cottage seemed to be a judgment on those attempts, a reminder that there was no real way out of danger and scrutiny due to the arrangement he had been born into. At Kensington Palace, a precarious new normal had been formed by late December. The kids were adjusting to new schedules, and while their schools were kept up to date on security developments, they continued their schooling with the goal of maintaining as much regularity as possible. While they continued to make decisions regarding their long-term living arrangements in secret, William and Catherine had returned to their public duties, their countenance displaying the perfect tranquility that years of royal training had ingrained. On the Windsor estate, Adelaide Cottage sat vacant while undergoing renovations that, while nominally related to infrastructure, everyone involved realized were truly about attempting to restore a sense of safety to a location that had been irreversibly degraded. They only discussed it in the most indirect ways, leaving the issue of whether they would ever return hanging in the air between them. Every technical solution could be put in place, including sealing the tunnels and securing the cottage. However, it might be impossible to get past the psychological barrier caused by the knowledge of what had occurred there, who had been waiting and watching beneath their floors, and how completely their sanctuary had been breached. As time goes by and physical repairs are made, some wounds to the sense of safety and home do not heal. William and Catherine stood together on Christmas Eve, staring out over Kensington Gardens, while their kids slept and the palace was silent around them. They spoke in the subdued tones of parents who have mastered the art of sneaking private chats into the corners of hectic lives. They talked about the year coming to a conclusion, the difficulties they had encountered, and the changes they had made, their aspirations for the kids, and their worries about the future. Neither expressed out loud what they were both thinking, that Adelaide Cottage might stay in the past forever, rather than move on to the future. A casualty of the poisonous awareness that their home had been anything but safe, when they had thought themselves shielded by stone and history, as well as the straightforward presumption that royal security was absolute, rather than any particular threat. That's what it means to be secure. It has nothing to do with barriers, sensors, or security measures. It has to do with belief. And no amount of remodeling will completely restore that illusion once it is shattered, and you realize that someone was present in the dark beneath your floors as your kids slept.